Hello, ladies and gentlemen. So, in our last lesson, we took a look at the multitude of events surrounding the Russian revolutions of 1917. And where we kind of ended our coverage was in looking at then how the Russian revolutions directly lead to this kind of interconnected conflict called the Russian Civil War, which had pitted the Red Army versus the White Army for this struggle to see who would be in ultimate control of the country of Russia. Today, we're going to kind of pick up from that topic then by specifically looking at the actions of Vladimir Lenin from 1918 through 1922 as he kind of oversees the Bolshevik Party, as he successfully leads them through the Russian Civil War, and as he sets up this newly created country called the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. And why, this topic is one that I find to be super important, that frankly I'm always shocked by how it gets kind of glossed over in the history books, is that if you understand what Lenin was trying to do, if you understand what the government structure that he set up was like, it really helps you then understand how Joseph Stalin ends up rising to power. And then it also helps you understand the actions of the Soviet government post-Stalin as well. So really an important kind of focus here that we're going to try to delve into in this kind of accelerated mini lesson. Now, Lenin was somebody that, I think you can kind of best characterize as a zealot. He was somebody that 100% believed in his ideas and ideologies. He was a tireless worker. Pretty much any depictions of him describe him as being somebody that would work, 16, 17 hours a day, 7 days a week. So he was a workaholic to the extreme. He was somebody that lived under a tremendous amount of stress. During the years of the Russian Civil War, he had somewhere in the neighborhood of 4 or 5 major assassination attempts against him, including one attempt where he was actually wounded in the neck in a manner that doctors could not remove the bullet. So he was just constantly under an enormous amount of strain. And I think that, if he would have had available, modern day medical technology, he's probably somebody that suffered from severe high blood pressure, because ultimately he is going to die of a series of strokes, probably stress-related strokes brought on by 1923. Now, the other thing I think that it's important to understand about Lenin is, despite being this kind of radical zealot, this believer in communist ideology, he was also somebody who was very much a realist, and he was somebody that did not necessarily just prescribe to the word for word beliefs of Marx and Engels in the Communist Manifesto. One of the analogies that I've heard about Lenin and Marx and Stalin before that I think is a really apt analogy to kind of help us wrap our minds around, who these people were and kind of how they thought, was that the analogy was that, well, Marx was in essence, the architect. So he was the idea guy. He was the guy that kind of laid out the blueprints for what a communist society should look like. Lenin then, was the realist. So he was the builder. He was the one that took the ideas of Marx and said, okay, well, he's calling for this, high voltage ceiling here, but that won't work because it won't support the load. And so we maybe need to change his design a little bit to fit reality. And then basically Stalin is the guy who is going to move in to the house that Lenin builds, and it's pretty much going to change everything. I'm going to knock out a wall here. I'm going to, change the kitchen countertop. I'm going to, paint the ceiling a different color. I'm going to decorate it completely differently. So we go from idea to reality to then something that gets completely changed under the reign of Joseph Stalin. Now, in terms of some of their kind of core beliefs and how specifically Marx and Lenin were different, I mean, we had previously highlighted that, Marx had this vision that a communist government would only come into being in a super wealthy industrialized society, somewhere like a Great Britain, somewhere like a Germany, somewhere like a United States, where people's conditions would get so bad that eventually you would just have this spontaneous revolution of factory workers who would rise up, revolt, and take control of all the factors of production. Well, of course, what we end up seeing is that communism takes hold primarily in rural countries. And Lenin was somebody that throughout his time at the helm of leadership of the Soviet Union, first and foremost, his focus was always on how can I improve the lives of the peasant class. How can I deliver on some of these promises that I had made during the Russian revolutions? How can I give these people land? How can I improve the amount of money that they're making? How can I get bread production up? So again, when we see kind of the spread of communism post 1917, it's almost always going to be primarily in more agricultural regions of the world. The other thing too that Lenin kind of believed that very much differed from Marx was so Marx said, okay, it's just going to be a spontaneous thing, right? Conditions are going to get so bad, and you're just going to get this revolt that's going to happen. And Lenin said, no, that's ridiculous. That all successful revolutions are planned and carried out by like a core group of leadership. That we had seen that, in France back in the 1790s, that we had seen it in 1917 with the overthrow of the provisional government, that the only reason that these revolutions worked was that they were very well organized and coordinated, by especially a core leadership group. So as early as 1919, Lenin, was thinking about this not just as just a singular revolution in Russia, but rather that this is part of a worldwide revolution. That this revolutionary ideas need to be exported elsewhere, that you need to set up kind of cells in other countries, that you need to arm and train the leadership there. So I put a reference here to something called Comintern. And Comintern becomes a huge part of Soviet foreign policy moving forward. That you'd have these meetings of international communists from all over the globe that would get together every year, and they would kind of game plan for how are we going to carry out the next steps of this global revolution. So a huge part of the Soviet Union's budget is always going to be devoted to continuing this planned, organized spread. Some other things as well where they differed. So we had previously highlighted the fact that, Marx was a believer in both economic as well as political equality, that he thought in a utopian communist state that, every single person would have a right to vote on all things, that everybody would be 100% politically equal. And Lenin, basically said, well, no, a true communist state should be a one-party state. You should have the Communist Party or this core group of people, because those are the people that are going to keep us on track. Those are the people that know what the ultimate end goal is. Those are the people that have studied communist thought and ideology. And so you shouldn't have political freedom whatsoever. Now, one thing that Lenin didn't believe in was he didn't believe in dictatorship. I mean, he thought that, hey, you should have this party, and to politically participate, you need to be a member of the party. But he did not believe in one person having total unchecked power. But again, just an example of, generally direct democracy does not work on a large scale. And Lenin understood that and said, okay, in order to make this an efficient government structure, you got to have this one party state. And then finally, the last thing to note that, again, I think is really important is that Marx thought that, like, okay, when this, revolution occurs, that like tomorrow we're going to have utopian communism, like that tomorrow everything is going to be perfect. And Lenin understood that, well, no, this is going to be really gradual, that this might take years, that this might take decades, that this might take generations before we get to kind of this pure communist model. So especially after 1917, one of the things I always mention to people is that, so Lenin had made this promise that if you vote for the Bolsheviks, we will give you land, bread, and peace. Well, the first thing that he does after kind of gaining power in early 1918 is he goes into some of these rural areas and he starts to break up these large land holdings. Now, again, the Red Army was extremely ruthless. If you were somebody that resisted them, they had no qualms about massacring you, your family, anybody that you'd ever known. They were not above, of course, taking wealth by force. I mean, I always say to kind of sum up the Russian Civil War in a nutshell, I mean, we're talking here in about a 5-year span, somewhere in the neighborhood of 14 million people dying from a combination of war losses, of disease, of starvation. Remember, during this period, you have the Spanish flu, global influenza pandemic. So you have no, real centralized planning to combat that in the context of this huge internal civil war. So again, why I bring this up? So Lenin goes into these areas and breaks up these land holdings, and then starts to redistribute it to common peasants. So, all right, you get this chunk of land, and hey, you get this chunk of land. Now, these were not massive communal farms like we are later going to see in the Soviet Union. These were privately owned farms, and these peasants were basically encouraged to farm as much as humanly possible, to sell your crops for a profit, to try to maximize the amount of money that you make. So again, this wasn't really pure communism agriculturally that Lenin was setting up. Rather, you could say it was more of like a socialist approach to farming, that we're taking from the haves, we're giving to the have-nots, but then we're kind of encouraging you to produce as much as humanly possible so that you personally can reap the benefits. Likewise, during this kind of interim period, he allowed foreign businesses and private businesses to continue operating, in essence, the way that they always had. So there was foreign-owned hotels, and there was, fancy restaurants open, in Moscow, and there was private businesses and people making lots of profit, because he understood that at the end of the day, the Russian economy had been destroyed. That he needed to get the economy back on track, and that he needed to kind of up the food supply so that he could fulfill that promise. And for the most part, it did work. The other thing, too, the third part, the peace part of his whole motto, in 1918, he negotiates a peace treaty with the Germans, something called the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. I always mispronounce that name, where he basically said, all right, we're going to give you, this huge amount of territory in Western Russia in exchange for peace. And of course, then what we see is moving forward in the Russian Civil War and after the German surrender is that, Russia ends up going and reconquering a lot of these ceded territories. So there's a lot of, fighting that goes on in many theaters up through 1922. Both in the context of like the end of World War I, the follow-up to World War I, as well as the Russian Civil War. So he understood that, hey, probably within my lifetime, we are not going to have this, ideal communist state, but we're kind of gradually moving toward that this is not going to be an abrupt change. Now, in terms of what he ends up then creating, so it's not until 1922 then that we see the official proclamation of this new country called the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, what we oftentimes call the Soviet Union. It was also in that year, 1922, where he changes the name of his political organization from the Bolshevik Party to the Communist Party. So for a while, those terms were just kind of used interchangeably by most people, but that's when the official kind of changeover of that name happens. Now, on this slide, I've kind of depicted for us a basic kind of schematic overview then of what the government of the Soviet Union looked like in 1922. So how it was set up to function, how it was supposed to function, frankly, how it functioned after Joseph Stalin as well as before Joseph Stalin. And basically, the the way that Soviet government was supposed to operate in a nutshell was it was meant to be a two-way street. Okay, it was meant to be something where decisions were made from above, from the top echelons of the Communist Party, but it was also meant to be a two-way street in the sense that there was also meant to be a voice for common Soviet citizens up through the command structure. So I'll kind of get into that as I quickly move through this overview. So at the lowest echelon of Soviet government, kind of the cornerstone there, the connection to the individual people, were these old local worker councils. Now, we had highlighted the role of these worker councils in the Russian revolutions. I mean, basically, these worker councils were something that if you worked in like a large factory, you were assigned to like a council at your place of work, and maybe once every week, maybe once every month, maybe once every whatever increment of time, you would have these meetings of all the factory workers or all the farm workers in your area that would be overseen by a low-ranking member of the Communist Party. And basically at these meetings, you would have a chance to express to this person any issues, any qualms, any problems that you were having, so that person could report it to the higher levels of the government. But likewise, it was a chance then for the Communist Party to pass down directives. That, the party has stated that we need to up production by this much, or starting tomorrow, this new law is going to go into effect that you need to comply to. So it was the way that individuals were basically told about the actions and decisions of the highest ranking members of the party. Now, typically what would then happen is that these low ranking members then of the Communist Party would then report to a higher level of government called a Soviet. And one thing, again, I want to point out here is just your understanding that, basically during the Russian revolutions, the worker councils were called Soviets. In the government of the Soviet Union, Soviets were basically like a citywide or a municipal level government. So you would have like the Pittsburgh Soviet or the Allegheny County Soviet, or in the case of Russia, you had the St. Petersburg Soviet, or you had the Moscow Soviet. Okay, so citywide government here, made up of hundreds, if not thousands, of these lower ranking members of the Communist Party that oversaw the worker councils and then would come together for these like larger regional powwows. The Soviets then, in turn, in addition to just kind of discussing and overseeing local efforts, would then choose a number of delegates from amongst themselves, which would then serve on the next kind of main layer of Soviet government. And that were these like republic-wide legislatures. Now, again, what I mean by this is that like a republic-wide legislature is basically the equivalent of like a statewide government here in the United States. Okay, so we have 50 states, each state has their own government, we have our own governors, etc. Well, in the Soviet Union at its height, you had a country that was made up of 15 separate republics, okay, Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. I think a lot of times people think that, Soviet Union and Russia are basically synonyms, and they're not. Russia, it was obviously the largest, the most populous, the dominant republic in the Soviet Union. But there was also 14 other republics that were part of the Soviet Union that were all centered around an ethnic minority. So, if you look at this slide, for example, you see kind of a breakdown of the 15 different republics. So, you had Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan and Azerbaijan and Georgia and Moldova and Ukraine and Belarus. So these were all different kind of states within the Soviet Union, mostly populated by an ethnic group that was culturally different than the Russians. Now, you might say then, okay, well, Mr. Heiserud, if you have 14 different main ethnic groups in addition to Russians, like why didn't these other republics like take control? Or why was it always kind of the Russians that were running everything? Well, basically, the answer to that is the way that the Russian government had kind of governed and overseen these other conquered areas dating back to the Tsarist times in the 19th century was via a policy called Russification. And basically, what Russification was is that the Russian government would transplant ethnic Russians into these other territories, oftentimes giving ethnic Russians all of the best jobs. So all the management jobs, all the government jobs, oftentimes were tabbed for ethnic Russians. And as a result, even though, again, these were populated by minorities, it was pretty much the Russians that were running everything. And then, of course, with that, Russian culture was basically encouraged and glorified. So, Russian language would be taught in the schools, things like, Russian ballet or ice skating, would be encouraged in terms of forms of entertainment. So why I included this slide in this map in particular is that it shows us in 1989 what the ethnic reality was in these 15 different republics. And you'll notice that in some, like for instance, like a Kazakhstan, basically the Kazakh people only accounted to about a third of the overall population. And those of you that are maybe NHL fans, once in a while you'll see like an NHL player that's from Kazakhstan, and you look at the person, and the person basically has a Russian name, and the person maybe, appears physically to be Russian and speaks the Russian language. And again, that's a direct reflection of over 100 years of Russification. So anyway, kind of going back to my point here, my central point was that you would have these 15 different like statewide governments then made up of kind of like higher ranking members of the Communist Party that would oversee everything within that larger territory. The Republican legislatures would then select delegates, again, generally more entrenched, career-oriented, members of the Communist Party who had served in government for a while, to then serve as delegates representing them on the national legislature of the Soviet Union, something that met in Moscow, a legislature called the Supreme Soviet. So the Supreme Soviet was to the Soviet Union, in essence, what Congress is to us here in the United States. So, at any given time, you might have, 1,000 members of the Supreme Soviet kind of meeting and discussing and debating. Within the Supreme Soviet, then you had a smaller group of much more senior members of the party that were called the Central Committee. And the Central Committee basically was the committee that generally oversaw the meetings and introduced legislation and kind of got everybody else on board. It was also the Central Committee of the Supreme Soviet that then selected the next rank and a super important part of Soviet government, a group of people called the Politburo. And I kind of disproportionately highlight the Politburo because the Politburo is something that we see echoed in a lot of other communist countries. China has a Politburo. Vietnam has a Politburo. So the Politburo, at least of the Soviet Union, at any given time was usually, between 30 and 50 of the top ranking members of the Communist Party. And historically, what we see is that a lot of these guys tended to be in their 60s and 70 years old. These were people that had a lot of political support from other members of the party, farther on down the food chain. And in addition to the Politburo really being the ones that made all the decisions within the Soviet Union, the ones that basically told the Central Committee, hey, here's what you need to introduce in terms of legislation, here's what we're going to be doing next. In addition to being the ones that really kind of oversaw foreign policy, the Politburo was also responsible for selecting the general secretary of the Communist Party, aka the leader of the nation. Okay, so why I bring this up is that, again, from Lenin's perspective, he was not trying to create a dictatorship. He was trying to create a system in which political decision-making was very much diffused between millions potentially of members of the Communist Party from the national level to the local level. While you had somebody who was in essence your chief executive and ran things on a day-to-day basis, somebody who was like your face of the nation, this person was not meant to govern alone. This person could only rule if the Politburo supported him, and likewise if the Central Committee and the Supreme Soviet and all these other people supported him and his efforts as well. Ideally, it was supposed to be something that, if a general secretary was doing a bad job, well, the Politburo then simply voted to remove him and would replace him with somebody else. And this is something that we're going to see farther on down the road. For example, later on, there's going to be a general secretary of the Communist Party by the name of Nikita Khrushchev. And Nikita Khrushchev is going to rule as general secretary for, about 10 years, 10 very influential years. And then eventually the Politburo is going to get sick of him and they're going to remove him and they're going to replace him with a guy by the name of Leonid Brezhnev. So it was not meant to be something where, hey, this guy would be removed and then, we'd shoot him out back and depose him. It was just simply, okay, we're voting you out of office and we're replacing you with somebody else that we feel would do a better job. Now, again, how this thing all kind of gets off the rails is what we see after Lenin's death is you get the ascension of this kind of small, little, bizarre Georgian by the name of Joseph Stalin. And Joseph Stalin is going to rise through the ranks and he's going to develop this kind of core group of people that are personally loyal to him. And when he is eventually going to be elected as general secretary, what we will see is very methodically, very slowly, he's going to start to kick out of the party and some of these different echelons of governments, people that he viewed as rivals, people that he viewed as threats. And then likewise, he would promote people that, were yes men and people that he could trust and people who he had their utmost loyalty. And so he's going to make it where instead of having just this job, being a kind of a consensus building job, all of a sudden you're going to have this guy at the top, Stalin, who is going to be making all of the decisions, and all of these people below him are just going to be going along for the ride. So again, we'll get into that a lot more in our next topic. Now, again, I mentioned the fact that, okay, by 1922, so Lenin creates this, the kind of the culmination of his life's work. And then what we see over a period of about 15 months is that Lenin suffers three massively debilitating, strokes. And you can see this picture from early 1923, these series of pictures from early 1923, is that by 1923, Lenin can barely write. He basically has a little bit of control of his writing hand, but it's very illegible. He is paralyzed. He cannot move. He's basically bedridden. He's mute. He cannot attend any kind of party meetings whatsoever. And so he is pretty much on borrowed time. Well, as he lays there kind of slowly dying, what this sets off is this major kind of battle for power and influence within the ranks of the Communist Party between Joseph Stalin and the guy who pretty much led the Red Army during the Russian Civil War, a man by the name of Leon Trotsky. And I'm going to end here, but as just kind of a connection piece, if you're somebody that's looking for a really cool book and you've never read it before, I know that some classes, some people have still read this as like a kind of required core read, but a classic novel out there's a book called Animal Farm by George Orwell. And it's this kind of a funny book. It's about these farm animals that rise up and revolt and chase the farmers off the farm and take control for themselves. Well, what this book is it's Orwell's kind of depiction of the Russian Revolution. It's him kind of making fun of it, but also his depiction of this power struggle between Trotsky and Stalin. in the book, there's like these, I think they're pigs, if I remember correctly. There's these three pigs, and it ends up where the one pig dies, and then the two other pigs kind of jockey for power, and the one pig, I think his name was Napoleon, ends up kind of taking control and creating this kind of authoritarian dictatorial state. So, I mean, you can probably access Animal Farm free on the internet if you never read it before. It's a really easy read, and I would highly, highly recommend it. So I'm going to go ahead and stop here because, again, this kind of sets up then this power struggle to ensue. And in our next lesson, I'm going to have you kind of extend off of this by taking a look at the rise and transformation of Soviet society of Joseph Stalin.